Good afternoon. Welcome to session H2, the LOMAC and LOMAR or PMR process. I'm assuming if you're here, you know what LOMAC and PMR stand for, but just in case, LOMAC is letter of map change and PMR is physical map revision. We have a great lineup of presentations for this session. And even though you're all probably old pros at this point, a few reminders. The presentation will be presented uninterrupted. After that, we will have time for questions. To ask a question while the presentation is going on, type into a box on the right. And I will say, having done this before, if you put your questions in early, it's more likely that they'll get answered. Just because when they all come in at the very last minute, it's hard to sort through them all. The other thing is if you like someone else's question and want to try to push to get it answered, like it in the question box, and it sort of catches our attention. Okay, we're ready to go. The first presentation, MT1s versus MT2s, determining correct LOMAC process for your project. Our presenters are Matt Richards, who is the MT1 manager at Michael Baker International, and Matt Van Wire, who is with Northwind Consulting. Let's roll it.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt Richards, and I am with Michael Baker International. I'm presenting today with Matt Van Wee from Northwind Resource Consulting, and we both work on FEMA's MT1 Processing Services contract. Today's presentation is MT1s versus MT2s, determining the correct LOMAC process for your project. This will be our agenda for today's presentation. First, we'll discuss FEMA's LOMACs, or letters of map change, and how LOMACs help communities become more resilient. We'll give a quick summary of the different types of LOMACs available, both in the MT1 space and in the MT2 space, and what regulations guide the LOMAC process. We'll walk through MT1s and MT2 project scenarios to give a high-level picture of what types of LOMACs are used for what types of projects. We will discuss the limitations of the MT1 process, and we'll focus on some example projects that are beyond the scope of MT1s. Finally, we'll take some questions. Our objective today is to help applicants determine the correct LOMAC path for their project. We understand that most LOMACs come to us and are time sensitive, and their approval is vital to a building permit or a real estate transaction, a flood insurance transaction. So having a good understanding of the LOMAC types will help applicants submit the correct path and get their request turned around quicker. So LOMACs are changes to FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. Firms are the primary tool that we use for identifying flood hazards in communities. And firms are also used for some other things, including determining flood insurance rates and premiums, floodplain management and planning decisions, and real estate decisions. So firms are useful and they're effective, but they're only as effective as they are kept up to date. So keeping them current is very important to guide the decision-making process effectively. And LOMACs are a tool that can be used to keep maps up to date between studies. So what are the different types of LOMACs? LOMACs are divided into MT1 requests and MT2 requests. MT1 determinations are used to make a determination on the mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement. So these are generally simpler requests based strictly on the effective firm and the effective flood insurance study for a community. And the result is an amendment by paper only. So the data physically shown on the map remains unchanged with the MT1. The MT1 types are LOMAs, letter map amendments, LOMRFs, letter map revisions based on fill, as well as CLOMAs and CLOMRFs, which are conditional requests. MT2 requests, on the other hand, are more complex and typically involve an engineering study or an H&H review by FEMA in order to physically change or update the effective map and the effective flood insurance study. So the results from the MT2 are the firm is actually physically changed and updated to show the changes made for the project. So what guides LOMAC processes and procedures? Well, the NFIP regulations, the National Flood Insurance Program regulations, a part of the FEMA regulations, are found in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And our focus today for letters of map change will be on Part 65 and Part 70. So here are the excerpts from Part 65 and 70. Part 70 is the procedure for map correction, which is the basis for the LOMA process. The purpose of the part is to provide an administrative procedure that outlines how an interested party can submit data to demonstrate an inadvertent inclusion of a structure or a property in the mapped special flood hazard area. So the maps certainly are not perfect. We all know that. There are scale limitations when creating a map, and that creates the necessity for this part. Part 70 procedures do not apply for topographic alterations or any kind of placement of fill, whereas Part 65 contains procedures for issuing LOMRs and LOMRFs. So this would be for topographic alterations and the placement of fill. And this part discusses criteria and requirements for communities that can assist FEMA in providing up-to-date flood hazard identifications when these alterations and projects occur. So this is the LOMA. The LOMA is a letter from FEMA stating that an existing structure, property, or portion of property not elevated by fill would not be inundated by the base flood or the 1% annual chance flood. And a successful LOMA removes the SFHA designation from the subject, and it removes that federal requirement for flood insurance. We do note that lenders can still require flood insurance, but typically a LOMA is the documentation they're looking for to remove that requirement. Certainly, we always recommend flood insurance, even if the mandatory purchase requirement is removed. And here's just a classic LOMA scenario. A homeowner on a lake is shown to be in the SFHA on the effective firm. They believe they were inadvertently included in the 1% annual chance floodplain, so they go ahead and hire a surveyor. So the surveyor determines that that structure's lowest adjacent grade, or lag, is above the base flood elevation for the lake, and they go ahead and submit a LOMA application to FEMA. So the basis of the LOMA application is strictly comparing the lowest adjacent grade for the structure or the lowest lot elevation for property to that base flood elevation. This graphic demonstrates a LOMRF project, a letter map revision based on fill, and this is a letter from FEMA stating that a structure or property that has been elevated by fill is above the 1% annual chance flood. This is an MT1 request. And here's just a classic LOMRF scenario. A landowner wants to develop his vacant land and put a structure on it. The community will approve a building permit if they raise the lot above the BFE. So the owner places fill and does just that. They can submit a request to FEMA for that LOMRF. There are conditional MT1 requests as well for projects that have not yet occurred. The CLOMRF is the most common one, conditional letter map revision based on fill. And this is a letter from FEMA stating that a parcel of land or proposed structure that will eventually be elevated by fill would not be inundated by the base flood if built as proposed. So this slide is just a CLOMRF scenario. A developer buys an undeveloped lot that is below the BFE and mapped as SFHA. He does intend to build a structure on it and wants to avoid that mandatory purchase requirement. So prior to construction, he wants to be absolutely sure that his proposed lag for that structure will be above the BFE. So the developer can submit a proposed lag to FEMA and get FEMA's comment on it. A CLOMA is another MT1 option for a proposed structure, but this is for a structure that would not be elevated by fill. So that was a quick rundown of some of the MT1 types, but when is an MT2 or a LOMAR required? Well, when physical changes occur that affect the flooding conditions, such as adding or removing floodplains, or changing floodways, or changing base flood elevations, a LOMR may be required. Part 65.3 on the slide here describes the role of communities to submit data on these changes to FEMA as soon as practicable, but no later than 6 months after the date that that information becomes available. So as we said previously, the flood map is a primary tool for identifying flood hazards, and so submitting LOMRs quickly in your community is the way to keep these maps up to date and to ensure that your insurance and floodplain management decisions are being made based off of current data. So unlike the MT1 request, LOMRs will physically change the map. The slide just shows a LOMR example where FEMA will publish a determination document providing the details of the LOMR. Such details like if the SFHAs are increasing or decreasing, floodways or BFEs are increasing or decreasing, and then also a revised map or maps accompanies that LOMR as well, showing the footprint of the LOMR and lets the reader know where the LOMR occurred. As with copies of MT1 determinations, the LOMRs are available on FEMA's Map Service Center website. We'll provide a link to that site at the end. And here's just a LOMR scenario of when a LOMR would be required. So simple builder in this case is planning construction of a new subdivision and will be rerouting a creek around his new development. So relocation or any kind of elimination of a flooding source, piping flooding source would require an MT2. And this is a slide for a scenario where a CLOMR would be required. So in this example, a home improvement store wants to expand one of their on-site warehouses that is mapped in the SFHA, in the Zone A. They plan to add fill to the adjacent wetland and expand a pond that is on site. That is mapped SFHA in order to meet local stormwater regulations. So as a result, the Zone A area on the effective firm will need to be expanded. So they would submit for a CLOMR. So common mitigation practices to improve resiliency need to be incorporated into the flood insurance rate. So we list some of these common practices here: building levees or flood walls, any kind of channel improvements or channelization, piping a channel, construction of a new bridge or culvert, or replacing an old bridge or culvert. Most practices to improve flood resiliency and mitigate future flood risks need to be captured on the flood insurance rate map. So that is beyond the scope of the MT1 process. So I will turn it over to Matt now, who will dive into this topic a little bit more and discuss some of the limitations in the MT1 process, and he'll also run through some project examples.
Thanks, Matt. And with that, let's introduce the MT1 technical guidance document. This is basically FEMA's compilation of the Code of Federal Regulations, technical bulletins, standards and definitions. It's a collection of all information that's pertinent to MT1s. It's publicly available at the FEMA.gov website. We'll have a link to this at the end of the presentation. The document's quite large. It goes over all the data that could be necessary to submit an MT1, what data requirements you have for your project, how the review process is handled, and what your expectations can be. For this presentation today, we're going to be focusing on section 2.1, determining eligibility for MT1 process. And here we've got a list of bullet points detailing requests that are beyond the scope of an MT1, and we won't be able to handle them through the MT1 LOMRF, CLOMRF, LOMA process. I'll be doing some examples, walking you through each of these bullet points to kind of go over, what the bullet point is in detail and giving you some examples of, why we can't do it through the MT1 process. I'd like to point out the bottom bullet I don't have in this box, but new technical data or mapping errors that warrant a revision to the effective firm. We are held to the MT1 through the MT1 process to the effective firm and the effective FIS if the data represented is incorrect, not through physical change, but maybe an error or something at the time the map was created, and a determination is reliant on that error being updated or corrected. that has to be done through the MT2 physical map revision process. We cannot issue a determination through the MT1 if we're not using the effective mapping. So let's get into some examples here. First top bullet was changes to BFEs or special flood hazard area boundaries. First sub-bullet was the creation of ponds or basins that would significantly modify the mapped drainage. So for this example here, I've just pulled a screenshot from an effective flood insurance rate map. You've got a ponding zone AH elevation 4. The underlying topography that was submitted with the request shows that this entire area is basically below 4. Most of it is approaching 0 or with the lowest spot slightly below 0. It's a square. You can see that the previous developments surrounding this were already reviewed and incorporated in the map, and this was a designated area to hold floodwater ponding. So the request we received is for a new subdivision. They're basically planning to raise all these proposed residential lots and roadways above 4, and they're proposing 3 large ponds. The review of these ponds and their storage and the change necessary to the flood zone is beyond the scope of what we can do as MT1. The source for that that large pond, is no longer there. So the BFE represented by it is no longer accurate, and therefore we cannot issue an MT1 determination. The review of getting these ponds to see where they'll hold the water and what the new BFEs would be requires an MT2 review. So the second sub-bullet under BFE changes is relocation or elimination of a channel or other drainage watercourse. So in this example, I've pulled another screenshot of flood insurance rate map. Here I pulled away the NFHL layer just to show you the aerial background. You can clearly see the channel. It was there at the time of the flood insurance study. Here's just a quick shot of the USGS quad. I believe this was a historic from the mid-70s to show that this channel has always been there. So our review, we have a request for this office building to the south. Do you see the channel? Because I don't. So here's an overlay of the NFHL. And you can see that the channel has been rerouted, eliminated, piped. We are not entirely sure. We would not be able, through the MT1 process, to issue any determinations, LOMA or LOMRF, through this area. The represented SFHA is no longer accurate. The source has been modified to the point that what is shown is not representative of on-ground conditions, and we cannot make an accurate flood determination. So, changes to BFEs or special flood hazard boundaries, the third sub-bullet, elimination of mapped SFHA or a portion thereof that results in a disconnected SFHA with no apparent conveyance for drainage. And I do want to point out that all of these bullets, they are referenced to as shown on the effective firm. Our determinations are all based on what is currently mapped, what the current study shows. So if the changes aren't shown, it's probably going to lead towards an MT2 determination. So in this example, we're going to go with the total SFHA elimination. On the left, I have the effective flood insurance rate map zoomed in on the small pond. It's designated Zone A, approximate with no base flood elevation published. The firm date was 2008. On the right, I'm showing you a preliminary firm. 2018 is the date. This is an ongoing study. That was the aerial imagery available at the time the study began, early on in the phases of the study. So we received a request for a brand new development. They want to get all these slots here at the end of this cul-de-sac removed. But the source for that Zone A has been eliminated. And therefore, we cannot develop a BFE for that flood zone. So an MT2 is required to evaluate, the impacts of that elimination. Should there be a new flood zone? Should this just be eliminated? How's this development impact beyond just this specific flood zone, but the surrounding areas? What changes need to occur? Ultimately, it's got to be done through the MT2 because we cannot develop a BFE for this. The source is no longer there. Further under this bullet point, we have disconnected flow of SFHA. On the left, I've got the firm with the 2 gray bars represent a a future subdivision, a series of lots that are going to be curving around a proposed roadway. And you can see from this image on the right, there is a drainage canal, there is flow. The BFEs are decreasing south to north, so this is a designated flow path from the study. So what this request on the left is doing effectively is cutting off that flow. It's changing the pattern that was studied and published. That's a physical change. The effects need to be determined and remapped, and that's got to be done through the MT2 process. Where's the flow going? Are they piping it? Is there any additional SFHA that needs to be created? How much of this existing SFHA needs to be removed? Those are the kind of questions that require the MT2 review to answer. And we cannot, knowing that the plan is to change the BFEs effectively and change the flow as it's mapped, we cannot issue an accurate determination through the MT1 process. Therefore, we cannot issue determination through the MT1 process. Changes to boundary delineations for a regulatory floodway that may cause a change, increase or decrease to BFE boundaries, discharge, etc. This is the next major bullet point from the MT1 technical guidance document. This can include new bridges or culvert construction, adding compensatory storage, building new ponds, or basically any drainage improvement, grading, cut, fill that occurs within a regulatory floodway. Anything that's like this is beyond the scope of an MT1. You can't encroach within a regulatory floodway and be able to get the project approved through the MT1 process. It's got to require an MT2 to evaluate those effects. So from some examples here, here's a current flood zone. You can see in the red hash marks, this is the floodway. Well, a new bridge and roadway was constructed crossing this. This is a major project, obviously. It's probably had some local, state permitting, studies associated with it to show what kind of effects this will have. You got to send that to FEMA. It's got to be through the MT2 process. Does this require remapping? Is there any changes to the floodway? Is the flow remain open? How does this bridge affect it? You can't send in no rise data through the MT1. We cannot evaluate that. We see development within a floodway, and it's immediately beyond technical expertise because we cannot determine what kind of changes that's going to have from the effective BFE. Here's another example. This is submitted site plan. You can see the channel center line. We also have the floodway limit clearly delineated. During our review, we'll do an overlay ourselves, and we'll confirm this floodway limit looks like it's accurately plotted. Well, the first thing you'll notice here is the proposed fill that's encroaching within the floodway. Any fill within a floodway is a potential violation of NFIP regulations. No rise cannot be evaluated or accepted under the MT1 review. If your project is proposing fill within a floodway, but is proposing it's not a violation because there's no BFE increase, there's no changes to the floodway boundary, that's got to be done through the MT2 process. We cannot evaluate those effects. You'll see here they're proposing to add storage, compensatory storage, drainage ponds, and they're calling it a stormwater management practice. This is good practice, but it's within a floodway. The encroachment within the floodway proposes that there may be a change, and we cannot evaluate that change under the MT1 process. Compensatory storage requires technical review that's beyond our scope to determine if there's any changes to the BFE or floodway boundary or discharge, no rise, etc. That requires a technical review that we just cannot conduct under the MT1 review process. For the next major bullet of the guidance, we've got examples for any man-made changes that are intended to provide flood protection and create resilience that are not captured in effective firm or flood insurance study modeling. These can include a bridge or culvert replacement. If you're building a new bridge, tearing one down, making changes that could make it different than what was there before, that's probably going to need an MT2 review. Channelization, if you're changing the topography of the channel, improving it, protecting it from erosion, any of those things that alters the way it was when the flood insurance study was created, that's probably got to have an MT2 review because it'll likely result in changes to the BFE or the discharge, the velocity, some kind of hydraulic change that may need to be studied and captured. Creating berms or levees are well beyond the scope of MT1. We cannot approve certification of levees. We cannot consider levees providing protection under the MT1 process. If you're doing anything as extreme as this photo, you definitely have to go through the MT2 process. So for some case examples here, we're going to start with flood zone disconnections. Here we have a small lake that's controlled by the White River. The BFE is basically backwater from the river filling up and causing this flood zone. So the development went in and they placed a bunch of fill and effectively cut off the inflow points. This is a berm, this is a levee. It's trying to provide protection, and it's got to require certification and review to confirm it withstands the flooding and will provide protection. So what this project actually does is it effectively eliminates the SFHA surrounding this pond, or more likely, it's going to force this pond to require a new review to determine new base flood elevation and new revised SFHA in this area, on top of confirming that the fill placed is going to provide protection from the White River. All of these things are technical in nature and they require an MT2 review. We cannot make any conclusions through the MT1 process other than this lake is controlled by the White River and the BFE posted is what it is. The next major bullet is changes to coastal high hazard areas, such as attempting to change an SFHA designation from Zone V to Zone A. Something as simple as taking this line and trying to move it. That's not really that simple, actually. It's going to require an MT2 review. How you make that change is well beyond the scope of an MT1. Fill placement in a coastal high hazard area is a potential violation of NFIP regulations if it's necessary for structural support. So say the structure highlighted in yellow, the second one down, is the subject request and they placed fill. That's a potential violation to rise above the BFE. If this is a community project to rebuild or create a new sand dune and the fill's not structural, well, it's not likely to help you anyway because of wave action or erosion. Fill for non-structural support often isn't even considered in coastal studies because it can so easily be washed away and eroded over time. So this project is probably a no-go through either process, but it is well beyond the scope of an MT1. So let's go over a summary of these examples. What are the impacts of your project? Is the resiliency you're providing moving earth or changing the topography? Are there new hydraulic structures, bridges, culverts, ponds, sewer systems that are being implemented to try to move floodwater? Is the current special flood hazard area reasonable? Is it showing accurate hazards? Should it be changed? What are the off-site impacts of the project? Are the people and properties most at risk clearly mapped to be at risk? These are the kinds of questions you'd be asking yourself and make a determination should your project be a LOMR, CLOMR, MT2, and be incorporated into the effective mapping. So anyway, that's kind of what we wanted to lead you towards. Help you guide from an MT1 to MT2. Here's a few links. We've got the MT1 technical guidance document, FEMA's National Flood Hazard website, the MAP Service Center, and also contact information, phone number, and email to get in touch with the Flood Insurance Mapping and Insurance Exchange. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and got some good information out of it. Are there any questions?
Well, I want to thank the Mats for that great session, and we have some time here to answer questions, and we're going to try to get through as many of them as we can. The first one, why does FEMA approve LOMAs where the top of the bottom floor and or next higher floor are below BFE? These are definitely violations and property owners believe they don't need to meet the code.
Great question. I'll take that one. So the idea is that if it's a LOMA, so no fill was brought in, that means that the lowest adjacent grade would be above BFE. So it would be an inadvertent inclusion. And the argument was that that house should have never been mapped in the SFHA to begin with. So it wouldn't have been a potential violation. So FEMA wouldn't pursue that violation simply because the map was wrong and that should have been mapped out to begin with.
Great. The next one had a lot of likes. Can a LOMAR be initiated based on improved local modeling of flood extent rather than a specific project that changes the special flood hazard area?
I can take that one. Yeah, the LOMR process can be applied to update the modeling. That kind of goes into the last bullet point from the MT1 technical guidance that I didn't really cover in detail. If the area is detailed in the firm, so it has BFEs or profile line, and there's been just an updated model, new data used, and those can be updated, that would be the LOMR process. If it's actually a zone A with no BFEs, then you wouldn't actually have to go through the LOMR process. The updated modeling and data could just be submitted through the MT1, and we would use this best available data because there's nothing there previously to use. So that's kind of the quick answer.
Okay, great. The next one, have you considered establishing a fine for homeowners who submit a LOMA application with an elevation certificate showing the lag below the BFE, even after the surveyor has informed them that they would not be eligible for a LOMA?
Sure, I can take that one. So to my knowledge, that's never been discussed. We do get plenty of non-removal submittals sent in, sometimes where the applicant knows that's going to be a non-removal, sometimes where they don't. But we do see sometimes, even if they know it's going to be a non-removal, they will submit. And when their LOMA is denied, it will have the BFE published on there. So they have that information, even though the mandatory purchase requirement isn't removed. So it's still useful to them, could be useful for insurance rating purposes.
Okay, the next one is a common scenario, a little bit complicated. Property above the BFE before development, fill is placed, consequently septic or crown of road, I'm assuming is now below the BFE. Topo changes, but not for F floodplain management. LOMAR F plus fee versus LOMA, still required by 44 CFR?
So if I'm understanding that right, if the property was above BFE before the work was done, then by definition, the dirt that was brought in wouldn't be considered fill. So as long as they can show that that was the case, they would be able to apply for a LOMA.
Okay. During the PMR process, are E-LOMAs revalidated if there are no changes to the BFE or special flood hazard boundaries?
I think typically it's going to be up to the study contractor. The E-LOMAs fall into the same process as any other MT1. So if there's no change to the BFE, they likely would get revalidated. But again, it's whatever conditions the study contractor is reviewing, which LOMAs, which MT1s get revalidated with the maps.
Okay, I'll try to get a couple more in. Can you request a LOMA based on outage shown based on a newer aerial photography with an MT1? Older area shows special flood hazard. What is acceptable backup data for this? National Flood Hazard Layer does not allow zooming in with aerial on.
For that question, we default to the National Flood Hazard Layer, the official website. That is the most up-to-date NFHL data and the most up-to-date aerial backgrounds that are FEMA approved. So the firms generally are too zoomed out for some areas to make a clear call. But if that aerial on the NFHL can be zoomed in to a level that you can make that call, that's what we would use. But we do not accept newer aerial imagery. It's got to be the FEMA approved layer on the NFHL.
Okay, I'd like to try to get a couple more in. Violations such as culvert in a stream or filling a pond are all too common. Even when coordinating a new county-wide study with the communities, these pop up all the time during appeals or even after LFD. No LOMRs nor notification occurred. I guess that's more of a comment. Yeah. Another scenario, building in the special flood hazard area with basement, but lag is above BFE. Basement is filled, converted to a crawl space. Submit MT1 for LOMA since the fill change is due to natural grade. Is that correct?
Yeah, that should be a LOMA. It's if the fill is interior, that's not really something we look at. The topography around the structure is unchanged. So as long as you're meeting the local building codes to fill in that basement, we would be looking at it as a LOMA.
Okay, well, I think we'll do one more. A road built through a special flood hazard area elevated above BFE as required by local ordinance, no intent or not intended or certified for floodplain management protection and not proposed to change the BFE or special flood hazard boundary extent is the MT2 required.
That I didn't quite catch the beginning of that question. If that is constructed through a floodway, a designated floodway, then it is going to have the MT2 required. If that is constructed in a special flood hazard area and it's detailed, so it's got BFEs and it's got a profile, and that road is not included in the profile, it would likely also have to go through the MT2 because we can't evaluate that it does not have a change in the MT1 process.
Okay. And then the last question I'll do is they're asking if you can make a PDF of this presentation available. It covers limitations of MT1s better than any I've seen. And I will remind everyone, I'll remind everyone that this is going to be available, but I think they have more of a hope to be able to have an actual PowerPoint.
Yeah, sure. We can definitely make that available. Shouldn't be no problem at all.
Okay. Great. Well, I want to thank the Matts so much for this presentation, and we're going to move on to the next one now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next presentation is how LOMRs affect LOMAs, and this is going to be presented by Patrick Dobbs of Wood.
Hello, friends. I'd like to tell you a story about a friend of mine named Buster Smith from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. In 1961, Buster graduated from Auburn University with a degree in mechanical engineering. In 1966, Buster started working in land management for the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. Buster was in charge of all TVA properties. In 1997, Buster retired from TVA. In his time since, he had started attending the Mississippi Floodplain Manager Association's conferences regularly. And Buster decided that Alabama needed to have an association and a yearly conference. So in 2008, the first Alabama Association of Floodplain Managers conference was held in Auburn, Alabama, because of Buster's hard work at drafting the bylaws and getting together a board. Buster served as president for many years and was attributed with the initial growth of the Alabama Association of Floodplain Managers. Buster also has served in many civic roles. He has been on the Muscle Shoals School Board. He's been the president of the Alabama Association of School Boards. He served for 20 plus years on the Shoals Economic Development Association. Buster's a very active person. I didn't know any of this in 2016 when I first met Buster in person. It didn't matter. He was glad to talk to me about TVA and floodplain management, especially in North Alabama, where Muscle Shoals is located. Later in 2016, the LOMR application was received for the Pond Creek Levee project. It was a TVA project with Barge Design Solutions as one of the engineers that was in charge of the LOMR and submitting the LOMR. The Alabama Association, the Alabama Office of Water Resources was the CTP, and they, through the LOMR delegation program, received the request in 2016. The request was then reviewed by Wood. During the review process, there were many additional data requests. As you can imagine, a LOMR for a brand new levee is going to require a large amount of vetting before being approved. Through many additional data requests, thorough review by Wood, additional review by the RFC and by FEMA, in the fall of 2018, that LOMR for the Pond Creek Levee project became effective. Later, in 2018, one day I was sitting in my office working, and my phone rang. It was Buster, which is not unusual. Buster and I talk regularly about floodplain management in North Alabama. So I answered the phone that afternoon. Buster was fired up. He was upset, which was a little bit unusual. So we started talking, and he told me that several folks in the communities, our friends and neighbors in Muscle Shoals, had started getting phone calls from their mortgage companies saying that they needed to purchase flood insurance. They needed to do so immediately, or their mortgages would be at risk. So as you can see, this is why Buster was upset. This wasn't expected. It was a surprise. So we talked for several minutes more, and then we circled back to the Pond Creek Levee, and there it was. And I realized what had happened. Let me show you. Please forgive the indulgence here. This was yesterday afternoon's art project with my 6-year-old daughter. We did this while my 2-year-old son was napping. So Juniper, thank you for the art, and Desmond, thank you for taking a nap. What you can see here is we have the unique situation that is Muscle Shoals. This is Pond Creek on the north side of Muscle Shoals. It's on TVA land in this area. This line here represents the levee. The dark blue are floodplains. This one's associated with Pond Creek. These others are sinkholes. Muscle Shoals has many sinkholes. They have floodplains. Some of them just have floodplains, Zone A or AE. Some have floodways, as you can see with our candy cane stripes. The black and yellow striping is the Zone X associated with the levee here, the new levee, and the new Zone X. There's a blue line here, kind of runs around and off the page. That blue line, that represents our LOMR polygon. So everything in this area was revised by the LOMR. Well, what the LOMR did, associated with the levee project, is it revised the Pond Creek floodplain through here. Previously, there was no floodplain in this area associated with Pond Creek. It was unshaded Zone X. The levee project and the LOMR added the Zone X here. It didn't do anything to any of these sinkhole floodplains. The only change was the addition of the Zone X for the levee. However, because all of this is inside of this LOMR polygon, everything inside of it is revised. Which means if there are LOMAs represented by these little dots here, all these little dots, those aren't valid anymore because there's no revalidation process in the MT2 program or the LOMR program. So all these pink dots, they represent families, except for these two. These two are when my daughter got tired of coloring blue floodplains, she wanted to make some pink ones, and the blue in the corner is the Tennessee River. So these pink dots, these are families that have LOMAs that should not have been invalidated, that unintentionally were invalidated. who were then contacted by their mortgage company. That's not pleasant. And it shouldn't have happened. There's no reason for it to happen. There were 78 LOMAs. It's far more than 78 people. It's 78 families. They've worked hard to have homes in Muscle Shoals. And now they're getting told that they have an additional expense, that they're all aware that they had worked hard to, get a LOMA, make sure it was appropriate, and that they truly were, outside of the floodplain and weren't going to have any insurance changes. So that's an unpleasant phone call to get. From Buster. Buster didn't like getting it. From the folks in his community, the mayor of Muscle Shoals didn't like getting those phone calls either. So what we did is, I realized what had happened, and we fixed it. So we got together, the Alabama Office of Water Resources, the CTP, Wood working as the CTP's consultant, my friend Clay Campbell. We contacted the MT1 team and presented them with, what had happened, presented them with all the LOMA information for all these points. And by January 2019, all of the LOMAs had been reissued. So it was good, but there was a struggle to get back to where things had been. I'd like for that to not happen. I think that we can do better. So I have a request. I would ask that if you're involved in the MT2 program, or if you're a LOMR submitter, that from now on you would check to see if there are any LOMAs within your anticipated revision area. Be very careful when drawing your revision polygons. Sometimes we make those polygons a little bit bigger for mapping concerns, and maybe they should be smaller if there's a LOMA in the area. Now these dots represent LOMAs, and there's a shapefile of most of the LOMAs out there that you can pull into a map and quickly check. So if you're part of the MT2 program, or if you're planning on submitting LOMAs, please acquire the LOMA shapefile, or contact me and ask questions and just check. That way you can make the community aware. You can say, hey, we're doing this project, we're doing this LOMR, there are these LOMAs that could potentially be impacted, and then you could coordinate with the MT1 program while you're going through the MT2 process. My second request is that FEMA make some small changes to the MT2 process. I'd like to add a checkbox to check for LOMAs. I'd also like to develop a revalidation process for LOMRs. This isn't using new technology or anything like that. We have all of this existing. We do it for studies regularly, and we can make some small changes and implement it for LOMRs. That way we assure that any of our neighbors that have LOMAs continue to have those where appropriate. One last thing is I want you to see that Buster, he just would make friends with folks and just talk to people. And so what that led to is he had the relationships to know who to call to fix a problem. He was mad, but he was hopeful because he knew we could fix this. And so I want you to try to maybe be a little bit more like Buster and just reach out to folks when there's an issue and say something. And, you know, and a lot of times I think we can come up with a good solution, whether it's a piece of 6-year-old's artwork or reissuing 78 LOMAs. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much for that great information. We do have some time for questions, and filtering through the questions, a lot of comments. People really appreciated the setting of your presentation, and I think the fact that it wasn't a PowerPoint, but just a casual conversation. So great job. The first question is, where was the required public notification about the LOMAR by the community to inform owners of the potential changes?
So, you know, of course, with LOMRs, there's public notification, and like many folks, we don't read the newspaper, you know? So when you do a LOMR that's on such a scale and you advertise in a newspaper, you know, sometimes people just don't read the paper and they don't see it. And you're not always, even if you've got a LOMA, you're not always looking out for that notification and thinking, oh, there could be something that's going to impact me. You know, we do in this case, I don't know that we would have done it. I recommend that with most LOMRs, if you can, you do individual property owner notification letters. That way you can initiate that one-on-one conversation with the property owner so that you can, you know, they can see that and then know if they've got a LOMR or reach out. We've done that in the past and had some success, you know, and you have some property owners that they'll call you and say, hey, I got this letter in the mail. What does it mean? You know, and you just explain that to them. So public notice was there, but you know, it doesn't always work the way you want it to.
I've definitely seen that before. The next one is more of a comment. Patrick makes an excellent point about checking for LOMAs when preparing a LOMAR. I recently prepared a LOMAR that covered about 12 LOMAs, and I would have had big problems if I hadn't checked for the conflict.
Yes, that's a great observation. You really should do that if you can. As an engineer or as an MT2 reviewer, you should just take it upon yourself to check for these. In this case, you know, the mayor started getting phone calls. I mean, that's you know, if you're a local engineer and you did that LOMAR and then the mayor gets a phone call about it, that's not going to do you well in the future for doing work around town. So, you know, I highly recommend, please, you know, look for the LOMRs. Look for LOMAs when doing LOMRs. Reach out to the MT2 team. If you don't know how to do it, they will help you. I'd like to say the presentation before with the MT1 guys, they're excellent to work with. They actually helped out on reissuing the LOMAs that were reissued for this. So, you know, thank you to those guys.
Okay, great. Have a couple more questions. The LOMA shapefile is good for LOMAs going back to the map mod era, older than that gets more difficult without pulling them from the map service center. More of a comment.
Yeah, so that's a great observation. One way that you guys can look for that is go to the map service center. I think it's an excellent website. It's one of the best things that I think FEMA has invested in. And download the revalidation letter. And so those older LOMAs that you're talking about would be on a revalidation letter, and you could look through that to try to discern where exactly those are and if they're in your area. One thing I'll encourage you guys to do also is, and I kind of alluded to this in the presentation, is to consider where the LOMR box is going to be drawn, because sometimes we draw it a little bit larger for mapping needs, for annotating features associated with a LOMR. So look for LOMAs not just inside of your revised floodplain, but kind of put a buffer on it and anticipate where that box is going to be.
Okay. Another comment that you may want to comment on, it would be great if FEMA would revalidate any LOMAs in a LOMAR area.
Yes, I agree. I've had some discussions with the MT2 coordinators for the PTS contractors that FEMA has. plan to have some follow-up discussions with some folks at FEMA about trying to make that part of the standard process. I'd like for them to create a box on the MT2 form, a buster box that says, have you checked for LOMAs and are there any? And we could, start with that, and then we could roll in, it would be, a first rough pass would be as simple as just saying this LOMAR is in this community. And then you activate for that LOMAR case, that community within the SOMA tool that is used for studies. And you could then roll in a revalidation process. It would be a fairly low cost initiative to begin, and it would result in really high value because you're directly impacting, your most valuable stakeholders, which is our friends and neighbors.
Okay. Another related comment was, I totally agree. LOMAR should take into consideration of MT1s before issuance and get them revalidated before the LOMAR becomes effective.
Yes, I agree with that. And that brings up a good point. These markers, I forgot to mention, if you guys have smell-o-vision, they're smelly markers. Some of them smell good. The blue is blueberry. Some of them do not smell good. The light blue for the LOMAR box smells like dirty laundry. So keep that in mind.
And then I have one more question here. MT1s impacted by LOMRs fall within the regulatory requirement for notification, since those properties are being adversely affected by the LOMR. So why are they not a mandatory part of the MT2 notification process?
I mean, they're notified. They're just not actively revalidated or reissued. And that's where we need. We have folks that own homes that have gone through the trouble to get a LOMA. And then another, entity decides that a LOMAR is necessary. And it's good to do LOMARs. We get valuable updates to our maps from those. But just because someone else does those doesn't mean that we should go back to a homeowner and ask them to do more work as a result. We should just take care of that. We take care of it in the studies process. Let's take care of it in the MT2 process. Okay.
Our audience is still sending questions and comments hot and heavy, so we have a few more minutes, and I'll try to get a few more in. Didn't someone at the community have to sign off on the application overview and concurrence form?
Absolutely, and they did not know that it was going to invalidate all those LOMAs. It wasn't thought of. It just, everything in the process was done correctly. I mean, everything was done perfectly, and no one thought about it. I mean, the level of review for this project in particular, I would be surprised if there's any LOMRs that had the level of review that this one had. I mean, it was a brand new levee being constructed. So you've got all your regular LOMR review going on and your levee review going on. And this was extensive review, and everything had to be perfect. There was lots of back and forth with the requester, the community, FEMA, the PTS contractor, all kinds of back and forth. No one ever asked, are there LOMAs here? The answer is, if there had been a checkbox, it would have taken care of everything, because the city knows that there are lots of LOMAs. But nobody asked the question because they didn't think, because they know in the study process it's taken care of. Yeah. And they assumed in the MT2 process it would be taken care of.
Another related comment is there should have been a better outreach than just the newspaper notification. And I think everyone at the community level kind of feels that.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Not one more question, or maybe two more. Why wouldn't the higher elevation of each LOMA site not have been picked up by the new mapping?
The new mapping did not change anything in this area other than the Zone X designation. So there were no changes to the AE zones here. So there was no new mapping done for the AE zones. The only new mapping was done for the Zone X.
Okay. And it looks like I can do one more. Well, we're not going to do that question because I touched the wrong screen and the questions disappeared on me. So
that's okay, I understand.
It kind of put you on the hot seat here for things that are more process related that you don't have control of. There was one comment that said perhaps the local floodplain manager could have a little bit more training or think about these things. So Patrick, I want to thank you so much. Obviously, your presentation elicited a lot of comments and questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys. Feel free to connect with me, and we can hopefully make something good happen here.
Okay, great. Now we'll head on to our last presentation, Processing PMRs, Challenges and Success. And this is going to be presented by Jeff Zanotti, who's the GIS manager at Wood.
Hi, I am Jeff Zanotti, and today I'll be talking to you about processing physical map revisions, challenges and successes. This presentation will focus on the physical map revision for the city of Atmore, Alabama. Wood performed a study for the state of Alabama's Office of Water Resources. I served as the assistant project manager and then the project manager for the final portions of the project. The city of Atmore is a small community in the southwestern corner of Alabama, right along the Alabama-Florida border, sitting in Escambia County along Interstate 65. It is a small mill town, best known for being the birthplace of Evander Holyfield and the home of Holman Correction Facility, which houses one of the 2 mill death rows in the state. At a macro scale level, the overview of the City of Atmore physical map revision is pretty straightforward. The project was added to the funding priorities list in July 2015 and funded by FEMA in October 2016. The project kicked off in April 2017, then it went preliminary in June 2018, then finally effective in March of this year. The study itself included just 5 firm panels being reissued and 20 miles of approximate streams being revised. This still led to 75 structures being removed from the special flood hazard areas. What was the need for this physical map revision in the first place, though? In 2007, FEMA's map modernization program turned Escambia's old paper maps into digital products through digitization. Then, in 2012, a countywide project was undertaken to restudy its streams. For modeling at this time, the digital elevation models used were 10-meter USGS DEMs. The results of these updated floodplains proved to be in large Zone A floodplains along the City of Atmore and its boundaries with unincorporated Escambia County. Although no appeals were filed at the preliminary stage, concerns were raised from the city after it went effective. In 2013, new QL2 LiDAR was collected and allowed the city's concerns to be validated. Here we have on the left the 2007 digitized map for the city of Atmore, and on the right we have the 2012 restudied map. This area is along Beaver Dam Creek on the eastern edge of Atmore, near its airport. And even though the 2007 map is vector, meaning that there's no aerial background, you can still see how many homes were affected by the expanded floodplain in the 2012 map. You'll see this area of concern that I'm circling. Skinny there, almost no homes fully included. It kind of hangs right along the stream line. And then we have this one in the new map. As you see how bloated and expanded it gets and further away from the floodplain, adding several new homes that were previously not affected. Here is a similar comparison along Brushy Creek on the western boundary of Atmore and unincorporated Escambia County. Although this is one of the more pronounced areas of floodplain fluctuation, few structures were affected. It does, however, affect possible future development for the city. And here we see this area, once again, kind of clings to the water line. Whereas here you have a lot more backwater channels and a bloated floodplain in the 2012. Throughout the process of identifying the problem and working out its resolution, a key component was communication. The Office of Water Resources and the community stayed in contact about plans to rectify the situation in their city. Reasons for the floodplain expansion were explained, as well as reasons given for why the new PMR would alleviate the issue and not make it worse. This meant going into detail about the nuances of digital elevation models and how they try to represent real-world environments. Various options were discussed on how to get the revised study funded and prioritized, as no clear path at the time was deemed the easiest. The local officials in Atmore were very proactive and knowledgeable, but in a city that size, it did not have its own GIS department, and thus had very little interactions, if any, with digital elevation models and/or LiDAR. During one of the meetings with the community, we had two GIS experts, one a consultant and the other from OWR itself, break down the differences between the 10-meter USGS DM and the new 1-meter LiDAR. Explain the concept of resolution equaling one square of given dimensions having one soil elevation value helped the community get a grasp on how big of a difference topographic data made to the floodplain modeling and helped us gain their buy-in. This helped us to clearly define exactly what had gone wrong with the topographic data and how it made an enlarged floodplain, and how the new LiDAR ensured that new modeling would not be in vain and not make the situation worse than it already was. As buy-in was achieved, a new set of challenges arose. FEMA had switched to a new risk map program and changed the idea of countywide studies to watershed studies at the HUC 8 level. Although this makes a ton of sense in the grand scheme of projects, it would prove to make Atmore's situation less palatable for funding to be granted. Escambia County already had a small population and had been studied relatively recently in the grand scheme of things in the state of Alabama, so it was not marked as high priority location for restudy. Atmore itself only has a population of around 9,000, so it by itself still didn't help raise eyebrows when future funding conversations were being made to try to justify the restudy. Even awaiting the watershed-based project study areas proved problematic, as the city itself was split into two separate HUC 8 watersheds. This meant that when finally a watershed was approved with Atmore in it, only half of the city would be studied at that time, and the other half would have to wait for the other watershed to get funded. Here you see Atmore split in half by the Perdido watershed to the west and the Escambia watershed to the east. Both of these watersheds have very small relative populations associated with them, and also have large portions of them in Florida, which means they would be low priority watersheds to be funded under Office of Water Resources projects in Alabama. So finally, after much deliberation, the option was decided that a small physical map revision would be pushed for, just to worry about the studying immediate area of Atmore and the firm panels touching the streams most affected. Actual production started in April 2017. Just 20 miles of Zone A streams were revised, utilizing the new 2013 LiDAR. The project went preliminary in June 2018, then effective in March 2020. The end result for the community was deemed a success, as 75 structures were removed from the special flood hazard areas. Added benefits that the community received from this new revision were they obtained the full suite of FEMA's risk map program. Its database and maps were in the new updated schema. Since the city was done as one PMR, the city received its entire data set at once instead of piecemeal manner that would have if it was relying on the watershed study approach, where one watershed would be studied at a time, therefore one half of the city being studied at a time. The community also received non-regulatory products to go along with this new database and maps. These products focus on hazard mitigation instead of just an in or out way of approaching regulatory needs, often associated with insurance and city ordinances. These products include the changes since last firm, which is exactly like it sounds it would do, and indicates where areas have increased, decreased, or remained the same in the special flooded areas since the prior maps were issued. This has proven to be the most popular used non-regulatory product for communities. Depth grids were also included, which helped indicate not just if an area flooded, but by how bad the flooding would be. If there's an area that's going to be flooded by 4 feet, as opposed to one that's going to be flooded by 4 inches, a community is able to mitigate resources appropriately. Probability grids helped a community understand a percentage per year that area would be likely to flood. And stakeholder sensitive grids that focused on the lifespan of a 30-year mortgage let property owners know what the percentages were over 30 years of a property flooding. Also, hazardous runs helped give an actual dollar value, real life dollar value, to the damage to expect from the flooding effects. This is an example of the changes this last firm that helped stakeholders quickly analyze changes brought about by the revised study. This is Brushy Creek on the western portion of Atmore at the unincorporated Escambia County border. The green area indicates where the special flood hazard areas have decreased. And you'll see those here along the western part of Brushy Creek, and then also on the eastern. The red area indicates where it's increased, and you'll see just a small area here where increase occurred. And the beige areas here will indicate where the floodplain has stayed the same. This area shows a large contraction of the previous floodplain. This is a central part of Brushy Creek in Atmore. Here you'll see contraction of the floodplain again, but also see a shift to the north in areas that are caused by improved topographical data. Here you'll see the large contraction around here being removed. You'll see removal on both sides, but you will see the increase here in the north in a few areas. And this is where the improved topographic data has updated and aligned more properly with correct elevations. This is the eastern end of Brushy Creek in Atmore, and this is where you'll see the largest number of structures and buildings being impacted. Here you'll see a huge reduction of floodplain, especially here on the northern end, with many structures being removed. And you'll see another large area here. It doesn't seem to affect many structures, but another large area being taken out, with minimal areas being added. And you also take note to where the smoothed, rounded look at the floodplain here gives way to a more jagged, lifelike, realistic version of floodplain like you see here. And this comes with the smaller resolution of the LiDAR, or higher resolution, being that you have a smaller cell size, that you have a less rounded effect and a more realistic approach and look. This is the far eastern part of Atmore by the airport, and it's Beaver Dam Creek. This area by far had the most affected structures from the previous floodplain. And in fact, this is the area where the citizens had caused the alarm that brought the attention to the local officials that there is an issue with the floodplains. You see the green, you see a huge area. This is where the majority of the homes that were moved in this study were. And you'll see some kind of large areas, especially for this study. There weren't many, but this is one of the larger areas where floodplain was added. But if you look closer, you'll see that literally is just following a ditch here to low water and backwater, and actually does not impact any actual structures. This is Pine Barren Creek at the very southern border of Alabama, Florida. Although this was a less popular area for restudy, it did still remove various structures with a reduction in special flood hazard areas. As you'll note, it gets skinny and hugs the channel all the way down to here, removing a few structures. And here you'll see where it ends here at the state borderline. That's why it's cut off there. And you will see some small areas being added here along the backwater areas here. Although the community deemed this PMR a success, it did not come without its frustrations. Only 5 panels were revised that still took 4 years essentially to get them to effective status. It went preliminary in June 2018, but still took almost 2 more years to ultimately go effective. So some of these frustrations were due to circumstances beyond normal control. A governmental shutdown and the backlog that it produced caused the appeal period for the study to be delayed numerous months. Some of the frustrations, though, are ones that could be addressed. Even though this study was only 5 panels, it was still on the same review process and review time allotment as a study with over 200 panels. Here's an example of 2 studies that were going through similar review processes at the same time. The red is a Mobile County-wide study, and the blue is a City of Atmore PMR that we've been discussing. Despite the great difference in scope, these projects went through the same exact review process and review time procedures. As the City of Atmore PMR only consisted of 20 miles of Zone A's, Mobile County had all of its Zone A's redone and various detail studies redone, as well as all new coastal studies being done. So that would understandably require a large review process time, whereas you think 5 panels would not require as much. To further break down the Atmore versus Mobile County comparison, Atmore had only 5 panels to Mobile's 258. There were only 2 communities, City of Atmore itself and Escambia County Incorporated, that need to be processed for the MAP Service Center paperwork, as opposed to the 12 for Mobile County. Atmore's FIS only had 12 profile panels, none of which were revised. Mobile County had 285. Atmore's FIS was 1 volume long, as opposed to Mobile County's 5 volume set. What can be done to make this physical map revision process shorter for similar sized studies? One possible idea is setting up a system of review schedules based upon number of panels in the study. The given time for a study at QR3 and QR5 is typically a hard deadline, and other cases with closer deadlines are given high priority to meet those deadlines. Although this practice is appreciated to make sure studies don't have to change preliminary or change effective dates, it does often mean that smaller studies that are turned in for review promptly can be pushed to the side for more pressing cases. With an expedited schedule for review time based on panel size, this could help reduce this quote-unquote dead time. During this time, this is when you're waiting for review to come back, and you often is just sitting there not being looked at for some time up to a month, if not 2 months. QR3, which occurs before a study goes preliminary, is percentage-based, meaning only a certain percent of the panels are reviewed at this time. QR5, on the other hand, is a completely thorough review where every single detail is checked. These 2 different reviews make a lot of sense when dealing with 258 panels. With a study of 5 panels, these 2 different reviews become somewhat redundant due to the small amount that needs to be reviewed. As we move forward, the state of Alabama now has every county with LiDAR availability. This means more areas are primed for floodplain study updates to improve accuracy. These communities that were studied prior to improved LiDAR being collected or other communities deemed quote-unquote low priority due to population size or watershed placement may turn to similar style physical map revisions to address their needs. There is currently a path in place for these to be funded and studied, but there's much room to improve how quickly they can be processed and turned into effective maps. Thank you for your time, and at this point I'd like to ask if anybody has any questions or for me to elaborate on anything else.
Jeff, great presentation on the ups and downs of doing PMRs. We have had some questions come in, so I'm just going to start going through them, and hopefully we can get through most of them. First question, how was the Atmore PMR funded?
It was funded through a congressional inquiry and actually came from FEMA dollars. They're allocated. It was $92,000 were allocated for the PMR. And it went from FEMA through the Office of Water Resources for Alabama.
Lucky them. Second one, why no floodways?
They were all originally Zone A's, and it really is a cost prohibitive thing because there's only detailed studies obviously cost more money than approximate studies. And so it really took a lot just to get the money we got to redo the Zone A's. So the community had no real strong urge to have detailed studies done, and especially with the new schema, which I've mentioned, you actually now have the cross-section associated, which will actually give you a base flood elevation associated with that cross-section, which helps them get the really neat information there for even just approximates.
Okay, the next one. How did you find your FEMA champion that helped you obtain the PMR? My community is in a similar situation, and I'm looking at a 9-panel PMR.
So Chris Black was a floodplain administrator or floodplain manager for the City of Atmore. He's the one that first discovered the problem and how it affected the community. And he came to, at the time, the chief of the Office of Water Resources, Leslie Durham. She's no longer with ADECA's OWR, but she was fantastic as far as listening to communities and taking them personally. And she would try to find every avenue. Like I mentioned, it was not a very easy way to justify doing a restudy for an entire countywide, but she was very good at community outreach and listening to people and their concerns and doing everything she could to try to find allocations for money and things, especially things like that where we can easily find new lighters available and it should be restudied.
Okay. And the last question I have in the queue, some regions avoid PMRs because they take as long as a county-wide in many cases. Did you find that this PMR took as long as a typical county-wide firm update?
Yes, exactly. And that's what I say is a shame is the fact that you had 5 panels changed and the person before, Brent before, had mentioned he's looking at one for 9 panels. And sometimes you're like, well, it's going to take 4 years. That's absurd for that amount of time. And that's the thing is the community looked at success because it had 70-something structures taken out of the floodplain. But why would it take 4 years for that to happen? A lot can happen in 4 years. And it is frustrating. That's why I think there should be some kind of maybe panel size scalability to the review time and review process.
Okay. Jeff, I want to thank you for doing this presentation. I think you really got to a lot of good points about the PMR process.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So this has wrapped up our lineup of excellent speakers. The presentations, hopefully all of you learned some new things or about the letter map change process, or the presentations resonated with you based on the experiences you've had. I also want to thank all of you for joining this session on the LOMAR-LOMAC process. A couple reminders, all of these sessions will be available on demand in the next week. You'll get an email informing you about how to get online and access these presentations that will be available for the rest of this year and through the end of January 2021. So I'd like you all to enjoy the rest of the conference, and if you haven't visited the exhibit hall, stop in and during this break.